Hello. The Divine Code reading for January 6th, pages 425 and 426. We are currently in Chapter 4, An Accidental Killer's Obligation for Exile, Laws of a Blood Redeemer, and Cities of Refuge. And beginning at the end of page 424, topic number 12. Even when there is no supreme Sanhedrin to judge cases involving death penalties, the laws of the blood redeemer, as explained in this chapter, apply for Gentiles. However, there are no cities of refuge for Jews nowadays. So the laws of the blood redeemer, part of it involves a city of refuge, at least for a Jewish person or for a convert or for a ger. They would not apply, even in the days when there is a city of refuge, they would not apply for the regular non-Jew, the not-Greek who is not a ger toshav or a pious among the nations, who would immediately, he's like pre-approved as being a ger toshav, who could also run to a city of refuge. For regular people, that would not normally exist even when there is cities of refuge. And I don't know how the laws work for the Jewish people, but for pious among the nations who are still connected with the nations, and even the ger toshav who's still connected with the nations, they would still, these laws would still apply today, at least from a Torah perspective. Now, this local nations can decide that they're not going to allow it, in which case we don't have any permission to override the local laws in this regard. It's a positive obligation to pursue the manslayer, and we cannot do a positive obligation if the nations tell us otherwise. Footnote 151. Min HaChinuk Commandment 410, Part 25. See the topic, see the argument of Viturim and Kitzot HaKoshem Mishpat, Chapter 2, regarding whether a blood redeemer may kill an intentional murderer even before he is judged. Kihut HaKoshem is undecided whether or not nowadays, where there is no Jewish Supreme Sanhedrin, there is permission for a blood redeemer to kill a murderer. So there's an open question as to whether today, now when there's a Jewish Sanhedrin, then we're talking about the laws in Israel. Outside of Israel, they would not necessarily be applied in the same way, except the Sanhedrin is the one that sets up the cities of refuge. So all of that really wouldn't apply to a regular non-Jew today anyway, or even in the times of the temple when there's a Sanhedrin and there's cities of refuge, it wouldn't apply anyway. The question is whether outside of the system of the Jewish legal system, the blood redeemer can kill. It's really going to come down to whether or not the laws of the local government allows it or does not allow it. That's really what it comes down to. Whether there's a temple or there's a Sanhedrin or there's not a Sanhedrin is irrelevant in this point. It's whether the local laws allow it. And if the local law allows it, then the Torah would obligate a person to pursue the murderer. It appears that for Gentiles, this does not depend on having a valid Sanhedrin court, which has not existed since the destruction of the Second Temple. This is because Gentiles can be judged by their contemporary Gentile courts, and even regarding the death penalty. Therefore, within Torah law, it is permitted nowadays from the onset for a blood redeemer to kill the murderer, as explained in this chapter, although secular law may forbid this. Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg notes that it appears that there is no need for any judge of Noahide law, even those who judge cases that involve the death penalty, to be ordained from teacher to student in unbroken chain back to Moses. Such was the ordination or Shemitah of the Jewish sages from the time of Moses received the Torah law on Mount Sinai through the time of the writing and finalization of the Talmud. As this is known as classical Shemitah, due to persecutions and hardships, the ability to continue this process stopped until the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. Hence, any Gentile or a Jewish or Gentile judge can sentence a convicted Gentile to death, to the death penalty, if he is liable for this, even nowadays. Okay, in the time of the Sanhedrin, that's from the time of Moses ordaining the 70 elders through it still existed until the destruction of the Second Temple. And even after the destruction of the Second Temple, there was still an unbroken chain of Shemitah from teacher to student up until the time of the writing of the Gemara, or the time that the Gemara refers to. That was for Jewish law, and whether or not the Jewish court could execute a person was connected to that. The Gentiles never had that connection. Therefore, Gentile law would not rely upon the unbroken chain from Sinai anyway. The Gentiles just have to establish the courts of law, and would have to establish it according to the way that they establish it. I mean, there has to be certain standards in that, but it's largely standards that are created by the Gentile country, the regular country. And the regular country has the obligation to execute certain criminals, including the murderer. Within that structure, the nation would determine how the blood redeemer may or may not function within their nation. Topic number 13. The law of the blood redeemer only applies to cases of murder and manslaughter. A relative of one who was injured or raped may not harm the perpetrator, and no punishment should be inflicted aside from judgment of a court of law. So the case, well, I mean, you can still have a person pursuing the attacker in cases of injury and rape, or even in the case of theft or something of that nature, for the sake of pushing the person into the hands of the police, into the hands of the court system. And the court system decides what to do with them. We only would have permission from Torah to kill the attacker in the case of murder, and it can only be done by a proper relative that's in a short list of relatives who would have permission to do this. But anybody, even a passerby, can call the police, can bring the person to the police, connect the person with the court system. Anybody can do that, and it would be an obligation for people to get involved in that regard. But the case of murder, whether or not basically it's a question of whether or not it's punishable as murder in the Torah sense. And in the case of the blood redeemer, it would not be considered murder, although local governments might have regulations in addition to that. Chapter number 5. Laws of intentional and unintentional killing, and killing through negligence or under duress. In this chapter, we discuss what is considered intentional murder or a nearly intentional accident, which both would be judged as liable for capital punishment in a Noahide court, and what is considered a complete accident, for which a Noahide court would not give capital punishment. We also differentiate the situations of one who killed unintentionally but could have prevented the death, and therefore should go into exile and atone for this act, and the permission of the blood redeemer applies, as it applies to the cultural norm in any society. Application of this principle is subject to the laws of the ruling government. This will be explained, this will be emphasized and explained in topic in the last chapter, in topic number 3 of chapter 4. So we just mentioned 4, well, okay, and the case of one, okay, differentiate between that person and the case of one who commits unforeseeable manslaughter and is therefore exempt from all punishment or exile. And therefore a blood redeemer may not kill him, and surely no one else may avenge his death. So we just mentioned 4, and we're going to go into more detail of these 4s in tomorrow's reading, between the fully intentional murderer, the unintentional murderer who would still have liability for murder, the avoidable accident, which would involve the blood redeemer in exile, and the unintentional accident where there was nothing the guy could have done about it. It just happened. It just happened. It's not his fault. The four categories of killing. In chapter 4, we have explained God's permission for a blood redeemer to avenge the death of one who is killed by intentional murder or by a nearly intentional or clearly preventable accident. So the first 3 categories, the blood redeemer could, according to Torah law, intervene in the first 3 categories. In the 4th category, the blood redeemer would not be allowed to be involved. We have also explained the Torah law that in the biblical era, before the northern 10 tribes of Israel were exiled, a Jew or a Ger Toshav Gentile who killed accidentally and was therefore not liable to capital punishment received asylum in the land of Israel through the exile in the city of Refuge. Okay, I'm just going to mention, I'm probably going to keep mentioning this, is that when organizing the section of the laws of murder, it's important at the beginning of any of these sections, when we're going to talk about laws of this or that, it's important at the beginning of the unit to give definitions. Like if we have stealing, we have to say at the beginning of the unit on the laws of theft, what theft is. Or sexual and proprietary, that would be in the beginning of the unit, the definitions. In this case, we've done 4 chapters of discussing the laws of murder. Now we're defining, in the 5th chapter, we're defining the definition of the categories of what would be considered killing a person, and the differences between them, and the difference, this and that, this has this kind of penalty, this has that kind of penalty. The definitions need to be, when we organize a book, need to be at the beginning of the unit, not buried halfway through the topic. It's just my own idea, is that this, at least part of chapter 5, should have been at the beginning of this unit, so we would understand what we're talking about in the first four chapters of the book. Just a thought. And tomorrow's reading, we will go into we'll go into more detail of the four categories of murder, or of killing. Thank you.